Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar for this Dialogue of Continent, our annual conferences hosted with the Hamburg Institute for International Economics. My colleague Henning Voppel is here with us. Thanks on his behalf. Also, all our panelists, participants. We started this morning with a very interesting conversations about the global impact of COVID, where we were focusing much more on the more macro dimensions, where we discuss, the long-term impact in terms of fiscal deficit, long debt overhang, and how difficult it will be in the next decade to manage and to deal with these unintended consequences of the post-COVID world. This afternoon, we want to look and maybe to focus much more on the more global governance and global geopolitics. Of course, the background of this conversation for all of us is maybe what happened yesterday night in the United States. We don't know yet, and there are still uncertainties about the outcome of the US election, but of course, it will have an important implications for global governance, for the US-China relations, US-Europe relations, and the trend that we're already there in thinking about the decoupling of the US-China economic relations, the new relation between China and Europe in terms of perceiving China as a systemic rival, and also in a more broader term, will COVID-19 end up reversing globalization? And is security and central government will play a larger role? This morning, our panelists talk a lot about way to do a reset despite all the challenges we are facing. And are we going to see also maybe a reset in terms of geopolitics? We look at also at other aspects. Is the global governance structure that we are will be still relevant in the post-COVID world? So there are the questions that we are going to discuss. In the European Union, we saw also a lot of discussions about strategic autonomy, about sovereignty, coercions. So I think these are maybe the new concept and the new rethinking in this new world that is changing dramatically. In order to kick off our conversation, we have an outstanding panel coming, of course, from different continents. And if you look at the website, their bio has already been presented. But let me introduce our speakers this afternoon. Professor Henry Farrell, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins Schools of Advanced International Studies. Henry, welcome. Thank you for joining. George Kvirikashvili, former Prime Minister of Georgia, who is now the International Advisor at the EBRD. George, welcome. Jonathan Hackenbroich, and sorry if I misspelled the last name, Policy Fellow for Economic Statecraft at the European Council of Foreign Relations. And last but not least, who will be joining us, Professor Dongsheng, the Associate Dean and Professor of International Political Economy at Renmin University in China. So a wide range of expertise. And why don't we start with Professor Farrell for 9-10 minutes, and I will encourage our audience, please, to submit questions, and we'll do my best, to pick up some of them and to ask our speakers to answer them. Henry, I give you the floor.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to be able to talk to you about this. And I should perhaps, and Elzbieta, if you can move on to the next slide, I should perhaps acknowledge at the beginning that this is work which has been jointly done with a fellow colleague of mine, Abe Newman, who is a professor at Georgetown. So if I say anything that is interesting today, give Abe full credit. If I say anything that is stupid today, blame me for everything. So what we've tried to do over the last few years is to try and think much more systematically about the geostrategy of the world that we live in and about how it differs in some very, very important ways from the kinds of traditional geostrategy that we have talked about in the past. You can find past analogies to the world we are in today, but you have to go back a century or so to the pre-World War I era to really see anything that looks systematically like what we are talking about at the moment. Next slide. So the fundamental insight that Abe and I are starting from is a very straightforward and universally shared insight, which is that globalization, this globalized economy that we live in, depends fundamentally upon networks. if we want to think about how global markets actually work, we have to pay fundamental attention to the networks which enable those markets, to the financial networks which allow money to go around the world, the dollar clearing system and messaging services such as SWIFT. We have to pay attention to the information networks such as the internet, which have fundamentally transformed the ways in which we do things. And we also have to pay attention to manufacturing networks, supply chains, value chains, and so on, which have really enabled a world economy which can produce sophisticated products across dozens of countries and hundreds potentially of suppliers. So that's something that everybody agrees on, that networks have transformed the world. Next slide. And we had a standard story about how networks formed the world, which was that networks, a world of networks, will be a world without geostrategy. And this is a world that was famously portrayed, for example, by Thomas Friedman in a variety of books and articles, including this 1999 article, which I think is a particularly useful one, because it effectively says we are moving away from the world of geostrategy. This is 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so Friedman says that we have moved away from the world of the wall into the world of the web, the world of the World Wide Web, which serves as a kind of a proxy for all of these networks that are binding us more closely together. And Friedman's fundamental argument is very straightforward, that in this world of interconnections, we are not going to want to go to war with each other. We are not going to want to engage in various forms of coercion. Instead, states are going to find themselves fundamentally servants of this global market which has been created, and they will be forced to compete as equal actors upon this flat landscape which has been created by the global marketplace, without opportunities to engage in much of the same kinds of geostrategic coercion and posturing as they did in the past. Next slide. Now, of course, we know this is not the world in which we live. It seemed to be the world for a while, but over the last few years, we have seen the breakdown of those ideas. And we have seen the breakdown thanks to two consecutive shocks. One of them we have seen it has been happening for a while, but has really come to the fore in the last few years, thanks in part to the crudeness with which Trump has prosecuted it, which is the realization that these networks themselves can be turned to geostrategic purposes. They can be used for coercion and they can be used for surveillance. And this is something the United States has been doing for a long time. And Trump really brought it, as I say, to a new level of crudeness and directness, which made people realize much more directly what was happening. So that when, for example, we see Trump or other US presidents looking to cut Iran out of the financial system, the global financial system, this is only possible because the dollar clearing system is effectively under the control of the United States, and international banks need to comply with it if they want to remain international banks. SWIFT is similarly very effectively influenced by the United States. And what this tells us more generally is that these networks, these global networks, are vulnerable to coercion because they are centralized, because they have these weak points, these central nodes, which can be seized upon by powerful state actors. And we see this happening also in the US versus China relationship, with the fights where on the one hand, China would like to see Huawei build out the global 5G network because this effectively allows China perhaps to exercise some of the same kinds of influence that the United States has done in the past, whereas the United States has been using its control of sophisticated semiconductor manufacturing networks in order to try and make it impossible for Huawei to do this, and in order to hold the Chinese economy as a whole back. And we also see similar things happening at a smaller scale, for example, in Japan's efforts to threaten South Korean access to certain key chemicals for its electronics industry in order to win certain political concessions. Here we are seeing more and more the ways in which states are deliberately and systematically looking for the weak spots in the network and targeting those networks deliberately as a form of coercion. Next slide. This coincides with a second shock, which we've seen over the last 9 months, which is the shock of coronavirus. And coronavirus obviously is, the virus is not a conscious thing. It does not look to target systematically weak points in the same kind of way. Instead, what we have seen is a succession of massive demand and supply shocks to the world economy, which effectively reveals some of the weak points that we weren't previously aware of. If we think about the demand shocks, the sudden rapid increase in demand for various forms of medical supplies, which we saw in the first half of this year, and the sudden posturing that countries engaged in order to grab control of bits of the supply chain that they thought were urgently necessary for the health of their citizens. If we also think about, so in addition to the demand shocks, the supply shocks that we have seen as global manufacturing systems of one sort or another found themselves faced suddenly with unexpected blockages, where one factory or another, perhaps a car equipment factory in Lombardy, suddenly has to shut down, with massive repercussions for the US automotive industry as a whole. So this is different from the political shock in that obviously coronavirus is a virus rather than a political actor. It is an aggregate shock rather than a targeted shock. But now we are beginning to find ourselves in a world where the two are plausibly beginning to combine. Next slide. So we're seeing a new age of confrontation. And this confrontation is going to be enabled both by a continued efforts to engage in political manipulation, political coercion, and also by perhaps new fragilities that are revealed in the global economy by coronavirus and by feedback loops between the two. So this is something that is likely to happen even if, as is plausible, Joe Biden becomes the president. We are probably going to see a less crude policy towards China, less in the way of the direct protectionism, also perhaps a more coherent policy, because Trump's policy on China has been wavering and incoherent. But we're likely to see continued confrontation of one sort or another, because both China and the United States are using whatever tools they can in order to exercise control, in order to exercise some degree of domination. And it's very hard to see how either of them has any very strong incentive to move away from that. And furthermore, final slide, we are seeing how the global multilateral system is crumbling under the pressure. So this is the second time I've spoken for Marc. The first time was at the fringes of the IMF meetings about a year and a half ago, where I was with panelists who were talking about all of these exceptions to the global trade regime. I think we're now in a world where the exceptions are beginning to gobble up the rules. If we are in a world of geostrategy, then many of the assumptions which underlie the WTO are sudden, and similar multilateral organizations are suddenly going to become much more fragile than they have been in the past. Geostrategic and security concerns are likely very often to trump interests in multilateralism. And even if we get a more multilaterally inclined president in the United States, it is going to be very, very difficult, and I would say effectively impossible, for him to go back to square one. We are going to see a world in which multilateralism of a traditional sort is going to have to compete with geostrategic concerns. It may be that over the longer term, the geostrategic competitors will be able to come to a new set of rules of the road, but that is going to be a very messy, difficult, and tortuous process indeed. And with that, I will turn over to the next panelist.
Henry, great. Thanks very much for this very good to set the stage for the conversation that we're going to have. Let me now turn to George. George, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, Marc, Henning, thank you, and all the organizers for this really very, very wonderful conference. I need to make a disclaimer. Whatever I say is my own opinion, although I'm an international advisor to EBRD, which I respect and admire. Everything I say is my own opinion. So, this is a very interesting topic indeed. And before we elaborate on the backdrop that underlines and defines the next several years, post-COVID years, I think we need to also speak about important assumptions, some macro assumptions as well as micro assumptions. Also, if we speak about the roles of the central governments in the upcoming years, which is an interesting topic, definitely there are some assumptions that really define the changed or increased or reinforced roles of the central governments. So the most important macro assumption probably is that there will be serious disruptions in international economic cooperation. And the open international economic system of exchange and cooperation that we have witnessed and enjoyed during almost 20 years from collapse of Soviet Union, or even before collapse of the Berlin War, up to 2008, when the global financial crisis broke out, has been seriously challenged. And here, COVID is not the only cause to blame, nor the stresses in US-China relations can be held solely responsible. The pandemic and US-China strategic competition have certainly accentuated dysfunctionalities and tensions that were evident before the pandemic. So obviously, several highly probable macro outcomes will accompany or define the future developments. And they are: first, the current state of affairs is probably and most likely to be prolonged. And irrespective, we know that American elections can change things definitely, but irrespective of who wins the US elections, there is no going back probably to a pre-pandemic or, let's say, pre-Trumpian status quo. Second, I think that, and Marc, you had in your preliminary questions whether we will see reversing globalization. While the open international order is going to remain under stress, and it will fragment the turn inward in some domains, it is probably unlikely to collapse or reverse entirely. Because the open globalization that we used to enjoy was driven by two most important or key factors. First, it's politics, and the second is technology. The political conditions, whether in the domestic politics of key countries or international geopolitics, will remain unfavorable for some time. But the technologies that drove globalization cannot be unlearned and will move globalization forward. Maybe the speed, the pace will be uneven in different domains and different countries, but it will go forward. Third, I think there is very little prospect, unfortunately, for meaningful reform of key international institutions or the creation of meaningful new institutions, and to deal with a future in which there is a deficit of global leadership and in which, as it was said by Henry, US-China strategic competition is a structural feature of international relations. Most probably, to fill the systemic gap, ad hoc, domain-specific, fluid coalitions will prevail. The countries with compatible interests will unite around specific issues in specific domains, and such coalitions will continually arrange and rearrange themselves in variegated pattern in different domains as interests and circumstances change. These coalitions will exist as an overlay to existing international institutions, and they will modify the way in which they function. I will not elaborate here on the implications of creations of such domestic coalitions or temporary coalitions because of a very strong political determinants locally in the regions where I live and the country I represent. Definitely the strong Russian presence in the domestic domains and domestic organizations is an issue for Georgia. And here, of course, the balance that United States has been providing for the region of the South Caucasus or Central Asia was a very important factor of the stability, definitely. And I very much hope that it will continue so at some extent. Now, to successfully navigate such a future will require a great agility of mind and policy and domestic institutions that are capable of quick adaptation. And here we arrive at a topic of capacity and role of central governments. And COVID crisis definitely forces governments to balance a surge of demand for government expenditures with unprecedented funding shortfalls. At the same time, it is requiring them to find ways to build and fund strategies and programs to deliver stronger, more equal and inclusive and more resilient economies. The unprecedented demand for government expenditures has put immense fiscal pressure on governments, and they will need to pursue the full set of resources available to them to fund the reimagination of the economy. And here we have leveraged sovereign funding, reform tax policies, issued debt, monetize government-owned assets, and establish, very importantly, public-private partnerships will have much stronger importance and much higher role to crowd out and crowd in private capital, not to crowd out the private sector. This is a very, very important issue when we speak about the increased role of government in the post-COVID future. Here, let me stop my intervention and thank you for this chance.
Thank you, Georgi. Let me now pass the floor to Jonathan. Jonathan, please.
Thank you very much, Marc. Let me see if I can share with you my screen. That should be working right now. Let me first thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be on this panel as well, on this among these very distinguished speakers. Yeah, I've chosen this title, Defending Europe's Economic Sovereignty, New Ways to Resist Economic Coercion, because it's, well, one, the title of a recent report that we've published, but second, because I'll take slightly the European angle on things, which I think will be very complementary to what Henry and George have just been saying and talking about this, about the bipolar great power competition. And that's actually a good start. George has already mentioned the Berlin Wall. Henry has mentioned much earlier times. I'll stick with the Berlin Wall for a second, because it was standing about 1 kilometer from where I'm sitting right now. And it was the last time, of course, that Europe was somewhere in the middle and actually the battlefield of a bipolar great power competition. And that's a key thing to understand about how Europeans feel about this one today, where they feel like they're back in a situation. Many here feel like they're back in a situation where there's bipolar great power competition, two big powers reverting to geopolitical means and for geopolitical dominance, and Europe somewhere in the middle. Now, don't get me wrong. There's of course, no Berlin Wall going through the middle of Europe, fortunately, and of course, the great power competition is very different from the last one. And previous speakers have said quite a bit about that already, and mostly in that it is economic first and foremost. But that's actually, I think, still an interesting perspective to look at it, how Europeans are coping with the fact that they feel ever more squeezed between the two powers, which is a reminder of the trauma of past bipolar great power competition, and because it's economic, where they actually do have quite a bit of strength. How they are reacting to it, and what the current state of the debate is on the international order and the geopolitical picture from a European perspective. And so, yeah, what I'm trying to illustrate is that after the Cold War, some in Europe, thought the era of geopolitics was over forever. That might have been naive, but in any case, Europeans based their foreign economic policy and international policies in general on multilateralism and a rules-based order, a reliable partnership with the United States, and the idea of free and fair trade, of course. And previous speakers have already pointed to the fact that there's even with a more multilateral president in the United States, and certainly one that who has a lot more appreciation for allies, if he was elected. These three ideas have been put into questions for Europeans still, even the reliability of the relationship with the US to a certain degree. Of course, the next president could repair quite a bit of that. But so in this context, there's two key challenges from the European point of view when you have the two big players going at each other. One being, which is also a very different aspect of this bipolar great power competition for Europeans, is that of course Europe is much more in the periphery to some degree. But that also means that the US and China are not necessarily paying attention to European interests anymore, which creates already and might create even more collateral damage for Europeans. And at the same time, paradoxically, as I said, Europeans feel quite a bit that in this geoeconomic battle, because the European market is just as big as the American and the Chinese and bigger than any other one, this is a major battlefield, and it's going, and there's a danger of deals above their heads, of direct coercion, and we've seen some of that recently. So what are the instruments that they are looking at and that they have faced? Tariffs, trade curbs, extraterritorial export controls. The Chinese export control law is as many of you know, taking effect on December 1st. The US already has extraterritorial export controls, which really mean that in ever more areas, or that's in any case, that's certainly a fear here, European companies for re-exporting the European goods to a third country will have to go to Washington or Beijing, or maybe even both, because some components of their supply chains, upstream components, were Chinese and or American, and this is just one example of the big worry here of where you can see that Europe could get really squeezed between the two powers and lack sovereignty, and I'll get to that in a second. Forced sensitive data transfers really are a big concern in both countries, actually, even though there are big differences, of course. And finally, Henry has, of course, already mentioned them, financial sanctions, and the financial sector is a big concern in times where there is actually European state officials being threatened by financial sanctions, and disturbingly so by none other than the best friend and ally, the US, and even staff of international institutions like the International Criminal Court are being threatened by financial sanctions. And I think the fear is, and I know there's some debate about it, is of an Iranization. Henry mentioned the example of the Iran case and Iran being kicked off of SWIFT. Not sure if we're talking about SWIFT, but the Iranization of US-China policies, which would have great collateral damage on Europeans. And because the dollar is so dominant, there's been a huge boost to awareness in Europe to vulnerabilities, which also extend to digital currencies, where the US with its private sector, but maybe mostly China with from the public sector is much more advanced, and where there's an awakening in Europe that we need, when thinking about a digital euro, we need to take into account much more the geopolitical dimension of having a digital currency with all its efficiency gains and attractiveness gains that come with it. And so what we've done, and I'll just end with that, hopefully as an interesting addition to this debate on the geopolitical situation and what it looks like from Europe, is we've brought together a task force of high-level representatives from the public and private sector in France and Germany, and private sector is economic and financial sectors. And we've looked at a toolbox of 11 instruments that you can see here that is gaining traction to some degree in Europe. Not certainly we contributed, but not because of only of our report. But for example, when you look in the middle, the collective defense instrument, right in the center of the slide, is something that we looked at based on what the Commission has announced that it's working on, an anti-coercion instrument, which would give the Commission the power to react to economic blackmail, be it from the US or from China. For example, a car tariff threat against Germany that we've seen from both countries, actually, treating cars, as a security threat because of, in order to coerce, in this case, Berlin into a certain policy stance, for example, on Huawei, this was the case. And as part of this, since this is quite a bit about the financial sector, I'll highlight two instruments: the digital currency on the left. I've talked about that already briefly. Could go in much detail since we analyzed it in quite some detail. But also a European Export Bank, which would be a fully public bank to keep up trade and finance trade in the case of financial sanctions being imposed on Europeans, staffed with public officials and so forth. I think another idea could be interesting to you, and that is the idea of looking at the market distortion effects, which would be very much in line with the European thinking of a rules-based, free and fair trade order, which they want to incentivize, at least, if Henry's saying there's a competition, at least, between multilateralism and geostrategic elements. And the market distortion instrument could look at what distortions the coercion from a third country causes and correct that coercion on the European market through fees, through fines, rather, or other restrictions to operations on the European market. This is simply to give you an idea on where the debate in Europe is headed. It's not just the product of a think tank, but what this task force analyzed and looked at, as I said, and it's really the result. Just coming back to my first point of this feeling that the European place in this bipolar competition is a difficult one, and that there's quite a lot of concern and worry in Europe about being squeezed and becoming again the battlefield, even if in very different ways than with a wall and a divided city that I happen to live in. Thanks a lot. I hope this is helpful for the debate.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent. Let me now move on to Professor Dongsheng Shi, joining us from Beijing. Dongsheng, welcome.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so I will start. Thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great honor to share with you some of my observations about this topic, the new geopolitical order. Can you see the slides now? Sorry. Especially, I'm very happy that I see some familiar friends, the name of familiar friends in our audience, like Mr. Warren Coates, one of my old friend from the United States. Thank you. So the topic is the new geopolitical order in the post-pandemic era. Actually, the last one I sent it to the organizer of this conference is the geopolitical order in the post-pandemic and post-Trump era. But now it seems it's not necessary post Mr. Trump. Okay. So I will talk about three parts: the political influence of the pandemic, the end of the new liberal globalization, and the power configuration of today's world order. So the first one, the political influence of the coronavirus pandemic the geopolitical effect of the pandemic seems like a third world war. It's very similar to a world war. It speeds up the pace of the world powers structural adjustment. China was the first one caught surprised by the COVID-19, but okay. But thanks to this, its up-down mobilization capability, its handling of the crisis was relatively successful. Cooperation of the whole with the cooperation of the whole society, reliance on science and technologies. So today, Chinese economy may be the only, the highest growth large economy in the world this year. And the US had more time to prepare for the pandemic, while it, especially this presidency, failed in saving lives domestically, nor provide the world with global leadership or international public goods. If the Chinese vaccine in the coming 1 or 2 years, Chinese vaccine, as the President Xi Jinping defined as a global public goods, being provided cheaply to save the world in the coming years, it will be both symbolic and a substantial inauguration of China's global legitimate leadership, which will be a very tough competition for the United States. Then the second thing I would like to address is the world may rethink about the indispensable role of the government. During the Cold War, the US system emphasized, United States of America emphasized bottom-up political economic governance, which is market economy and democracy, while the Soviet Union was good at top-bottom social control and mobilization. China learned first from Soviet Union, especially in the 1950s, and the United States in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s, which made it a mixed blood and enjoys a comparative advantage of both sides, both are two empires. A powerful and capable state and an active and competitive market economy. To deal with this pandemic, the most effective way is to make all your citizens stay home for 14 days at the same time. It will disappear like a miracle, as President Donald Trump puts it always. Let's suppose if North Korea caught surprised by the COVID-19, I believe Mr. Jin would deal with it very smoothly, because he could make all his citizens stay at home for 14 days at the same time. But that's against the value and the belief of the Western societies. The pandemic may again remind the whole world about the necessity of strong government and a wartime mobilization system. So then come to the globalization. Yeah, we talked about the liberalism idea, but then come to the new liberalism globalization. In fact, if we look at the PIIE so-called globalization chart, we can see since 1870 to 1914, it was a period of globalization proposed by the Great Britain at its powerful height. And since 1914 to 1945, it was a deglobalization, which was interwar area. Then after the Second World War, there was a two parallel systems. One is dominated by the United States, one is about the Soviet Union and its allies. Then after the 1980s, we have a real liberalization, which was the new liberalism globalization that we talk about today. But if we look at the data, the global trade divided by GDP index, it has been steadily going down since then, since 2008. Then I make the similar chart, which this is a blue line. The blue line is exactly what the PIIE chart showed. And I extended to early this year to the first half of this year, 2020. And we can see the COVID-19 is hurting global trade more than hurting the domestic GDPs. So which makes this index going down dramatically. And more important, if we look at the red line, the red one is about the global value chain trade. And in fact, after 2008, the global value chain trade is also shrinking comparing to GDP. There's another index, another two indexes, which is more about, not about trade, but about the capital. The blue line is about the FDI capital, which means they really run some factories or some stores. That peaked in 2008. And more importantly, that's something that produced by myself, invented by myself. That green line talks about each dollar of the money base created by the central banks globally, how much more dollars it could derive in the international lending. So if we look at the green line, it shows the international lending is also relatively shrinking after 2008. So that answers the question about the about whether the globalization is going on or not. Okay, so I have been quite pessimistic since 2009, especially after 2010. I wrote some papers, gave some speeches about the ending of the globalization. We all talk about President Donald Trump, his trade wars against China, against its allies. But behind that, deep under these phenomena, is a demographic, is economic, technological, and geopolitical structure change that created these peak at 2008. And after that, the globalization have been shrinking. So finally, we come to a topic of the Sino-US power configuration. So this figure talks about if we take US GDP, United States GDP as 100% and go along the timeline, and we can see its challenges, how challenges is close to the size of the US economy. We can see this one, the first one is Soviet Union. Can you see my mouse? The Soviet Union and Russia. Okay, at its peak, the Soviet Union's power occupies nearly 50% of the US economy. And then after collapse of the Soviet Union, it's no longer meaningful economy. Okay, and then we have Japan. At its peak in 1995, it occupies more than 72, around 72 of the US economy. Then, because of slow growth and aging society, this economy is shrinking relatively. Then we have another group of states together. It's called Eurozone. Eurozone is not one economy, one country, but a group of the economies together, sharing one currency, but not the same fiscal budget. So put them together, it occupies less than, it has stabilized around 80% of the US economy in the history, in the past more than half century. Then we have the nearest very recent challenger, is China. Because of the success in handling the pandemic, China is going to reach 75 US economy size this year in 2020. It will reach around $15.22 trillion this year, by end of this year, and which is a new height since 1880s.
think we might have lost him. Let me give some time. Can you hear us? No. Oh. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Why don't hopefully we will get Dongsheng back to the screen. Maybe we can kick off.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Here we are.
Hello?
Yes.
I felt that I was out of the chat room. Yeah.
We lost you for 1 minute. Yes.
Pardon?
We lost your voice for 1 minute.
Okay. Only for 1 minute.
Yeah. Yes. But please, if you can conclude your presentation, so we can go to maybe to Q&A. And we
okay. I will conclude. I will conclude very briefly.
Sure.
So shall I the last figure that I want to show you? Okay.
Yeah, please, if you can.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
Good. Okay. And what is going on is China is being squeezed out from the U.S.-centered world market system. And you know, when China joined the WTO, China was a relatively small economy. It's going around the United States. It's exporting everything to the United States. But now China is a relatively, much bigger than before. And it's also attracting some other nations around him to play as a big market. And United States, frightened by the TPP, tariff trade war, and chips embargo, China has no other choices but building a self-centered market system, including the BRI, the Renmin internationalization, and the so-called Made in China 2025 and the Vision 2035 very recently. So that to conclude my argument, I believe back in 1970s, United States and China were strategic partners in fighting against the former Soviet Union. And then it was a master-servant relationship in creating globalization bubble. And since 2012, or especially after 2016, US-China relationship has already been reloaded to a confrontational and mutual suspicious track, especially by Mr. Trump's audacious and destructive policies. So in the future, to stabilize the global strategic order, I believe there should be some triangle relations. Yeah, for example, on economics, there should be a US, China, and a European triangle economic and trade and financial system. And on security and politics, it should be US, China, and Russia triangle relations. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers, but maybe I can take the privilege as a moderator of these sessions, maybe to ask to all of the panelists. It seems to me that there was some convergence clearly that multilateralism is really under stress. This morning, one of our panelists mentioned, that an alternative to multilateralism as we knew it would be maybe a group of countries, or what they call alliance of multilateralists, meaning a couple of countries will be able, to get together and create ad hoc agreement. So do you see as an alternative to the multilateralism as we knew it and all the underpinning of the international financial institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, that countries might go to an alternative and can group ad hoc alliances? That's number one. And a feeling that you see that the decoupling of US-China relations will be accelerated, whatever the next administration will be. And maybe for Jonathan in Europe and George, I did recall that the European Commission called China a systemic rival for global governance. Do you see that there is also in Europe rethinking about China-Europe relations? And if this is the case, what might be the underpinnings of it? But whatever wants to take the floor, please, Henry, Jonathan, or anyone else on the panel.
Let me begin by saying I wrote a little bit about the possibility of what you might call microlateralism in I think the spring issue of Foreign Policy, rather, a piece on the choices that face Europe. I think this is the easiest choice for Europe in that this is the one that springs most naturally from its instincts and the way in which it has used multilateralism, and it's also in its internal market process of integration in the past to spur each other. But I think that it's a very, very hard policy to really pursue on a large scale unless you have one of the major other powers being willing to buy into it. And you know, the extent to which that is likely to happen, given the given the presentations we've just heard about China going it alone, and given the United States approach, you know, maybe the United States will partly re-engage, maybe not. And the other thing that I would add, I thought Jonathan's presentation was very interesting. One thing I would say is that the conversation that I'm hearing around Washington, D.C. about US extraterritorial power is something like the following. And I think it raises problems for Europe. They see it, and these are the people who would be around a Biden administration. They look at the last few years and they say, okay, we were a little bit worried that perhaps if we overuse these powers, banks might begin to disappear, Europe might begin to resist more substantially. But we've seen Trump doing the stupidest version of this kind of power grab possible. And the pushback has not been particularly bad. The pushback has not been particularly problematic. So that I think that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. are looking at this and they're thinking, okay, what Trump proves is that you actually can be much more aggressive than we have been in the past, and you can get results. And this has consequences, I think, both for the likely long-term future of multilateralism and also for what the European Union does or does not want to do in terms of strategic autonomy.
Great. Jonathan, you want to add something?
That's yeah, that's a good point to come in. That's very helpful, Henry's view from Washington. I think, indeed, I think, I mean, I agree on the alliance of multilateralism that it's something that's very hard to do without one of the big powers. On the extraterritoriality, that's precisely why I would say we can see some movement on this now, and this is exactly the logic. I think for Europeans you know, that they are increasingly adopting is that if we want to incentivize multilateralism and disincentivize unilateralism, there has to be some kind of response that goes beyond Instex, which is a paper tiger, but not more. So I think there will be a point where, and the question is when exactly, but when Europeans will react and will exactly change that perception. The perception that Henry talked about is worrying indeed, and shows that some of the failures of European policy over the last years with regards to that topic. I feel like there is a difference there's a change underway though. Same on systemic rival. I absolutely agree. There's a, you know, when at the height of the pandemic in April, when because the Netherlands were contemplating a name change of their office in Taiwan, and there was China's Global Times speculated about a possible cut off of medical supplies at the height of the pandemic to Europeans, or to the Netherlands in any case, when for following an international arrest warrant and arresting Huawei executive, Canada got punished economically by China, and when there's car terror threats over the 5G network building in Europe, this does change the perception that, about China and Europe quite a bit. So there's an increasing worry. There's a huge interest in multilateralism and in cooperating. But when you think about things like cutting off medical supplies and the threat thereof, then that just inherently changes the perception of how much you can cooperate and if you don't have to build your own tools to respond to such measures, and that for sure feeds into the systemic rivalry debate, and the question, of course, to what degree is it difficult to keep going this Wandel for Handel approach, to keep adopting the Wandel for Handel approach, this trade for change approach has been dropped by quite a few now, and a much more realistic and realistic and cautious view of China is taken hold.
Great. George, you want to add something?
Well, my opinion is that despite the attempts of the current U.S. administration to disentangle these two systems, U.S. and China, they are still both the vital components of a single system, entangled in a web of global supply chains. And although we see the disintegration or disentangling in some domains, I think the complex nature of the technology domain is very important in this process. This is why I think that because of a very, very complex nature of the technology domain, I don't think that it is probable to fully disentangle these two systems. So I still think that the trend we are observing now is temporary, and it will reverse to some extent, but not fully, of course. And as Bob Zoellick was warning against pushing China to creation of Sinocentric separate world, I think the wisdom will prevail. So I think that the open trade and open system of exchange is a very positive global achievement. So I'm an optimist, and I think that we will revert to more open system back, maybe not to a degree what we had before 2008, but there will be some reversal. Now, as to the generally the prospect of the strong global leadership, which is absolutely essential, for re-establishing open system, open economic system globally. As also Dongsheng mentioned, the three potential centers, and he was talking about the triangle. And clearly there are three possible sources of global leadership. And there is well-known Singaporean diplomat, is Ambassador Kausikan, who very well described in his recent article the potential of reestablishing global leadership by one of the three mentioned centers. Unfortunately, the America will continue to be the inward-looking and I would say more pragmatic and transactional. I think that China will continue to be mercantilist in the future, and I think European Union unfortunately lacks the military power to have the gravitas that is needed for global leadership. So I think still that temporary, maybe the plurilateral approach will be a solution to the current situation, and reinforcing pumping out all the potential of the regional organizations, and especially we are talking about EU, which is extremely important for Georgia, for example. I think that this plurilateral reinforcement of the regional potential of the regional organizations will be important, but we should not expect the global leadership that we have seen before.
Dongsheng, please.
Yes, I will say a little bit about I believe it's a very good timing to make a big deal, to have a global real dialogue, not only among the scholars like us, but among the big power governments, especially between United States, China, and European leaderships. So only when the big figures can reach agreements about the basic principles and the basic logic of the 21st century global order, both economically, strategically, and politically. As George just now mentioned, that China may go, continue to be mercantilist. I personally have different observations or prediction. China is not going to be as mercantilist as before. Now, I agree that in the past, China was a very typical export-oriented economy, as what the other East Asian nations did in the past half century. But nowadays, China is expanding its import appetite. And very recently, China is holding, even during the pandemic, China is holding its online and offline together, import exhibition, which means China is encouraging the whole world to export good products to Chinese market. And the Chinese middle class is, by size, it's the largest. And actually China, if we look back on my PPTs, I mentioned a very important figure that China is now as big as the United States, the largest market, consumption market. So in the future, China is no longer export-oriented, but be more balanced. And in the big deal or big negotiation among the big players that I mentioned, I believe China is going to pursue a more balanced economy, no longer trade surplus, but even some trade deficit, I believe. That would be is good for the whole world. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, this is almost 4 o'clock. We need to close as we will be continuing our program with our next session starting at 5 o'clock on the long-term impact of COVID with a very good group of experts that will be meeting also online at 5 o'clock on behalf of the Hamburg Institute for International Economics and the Reinventing Bretton Woods. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time. I know online is not the same feelings than face-to-face, but I hope that this conversation will be part of whatever we do in the next few months, because multilateralism, based on our name, has been an anchor of what we do. You know, international cooperation is so important, you know, and sometimes I'm wondering this year, the case for international cooperation is so critical when you start to think about how you can manage a pandemic. You look back at the financial crisis of 2008, you know, it was all about crisis prevention and resolution. And I think we need something along the same lines for dealing with health crises. And I hope that the next architect of hopefully thinking about international cooperation will start to think that pandemics are becoming more frequent, like financial crises were very frequent. And we will need to build up the underpinnings and the institutions in order to deal with it, as we might be going to this type of pandemic more in terms of frequency more often. Anyway, thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you soon again. And we